The U.S. marks the 19th anniversary of the Al-Qaeda terror attacks. Plus, the U.S.-led wars that followed in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Next on The Heat.
Hello, I'm Arnold Snyder. Thanks for joining us. 19 years ago, on September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists flew planes into the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. Almost 3,000 people were killed. Americans marked the solemn occasion on Friday with ceremonies. President Trump was in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 crashed after passengers confronted its hijackers. And his presidential opponent, Joe Biden, was in New York at the site of the World Trade Center. Meanwhile, the impact of the attacks and the U.S. war on terror that followed is still being felt almost 2 decades later. We have a great panel to discuss all of this. Joining me now from New York via Skype is Tony Shaffer. The retired Lieutenant Colonel is president of the London Center for Policy Research. With us here in Washington, D.C. is Omar Samad. He is a former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada. Also joining us is Edmund Ghareeb. He is a Middle East expert and analyst. And with us too via Skype here in Washington is Brian Becker. He is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. Welcome to all of you to this show. Tony Shaffer, let me start with you. Looking back at these attacks that took place 19 years ago on the 9th of September 2001 and the subsequent wars that started afterwards, how did that change the United States?
Well, perpetual war has not been a good thing for the United States, and I think we all recognize 19 years to be in Afghanistan based on the 9/11 attacks is a bit too much. To be honest, the authorized use of military force, which allowed U.S. military forces to go into Afghanistan, has seen the essential removal, kill, capture, or otherwise dispose of the 9/11 perpetrators long ago. And I think we've seen other wars come out of this, the Iraq War. There's been incursions into other parts of the Middle East, which have loosely been based on the authorized use of military force. And I'm one of those who supports President Trump pulling us back from those wars and trying to end the war in Afghanistan. We here in the United States saw the creation of Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, as well as a number of significant changes. Look, let's be honest. Every time we go to the airport now, we're reminded of 9/11 because of the increased security requirements. So it's been significant, and it's not going to change. I think what we've seen from the 9/11 attacks is a new normal regarding security. One thing I am not convinced of is our ability to analyze rapidly to gain an understanding of threats before they happen. We saw some lapses during the ISIS period in Iraq, and we've seen other failures of putting the pieces together rapidly when necessary. So my concern, being a retired intelligence officer, I wrote a book about this, Operation Dark Heart, is that we must do what's necessary to depoliticize the intelligence collection process and understanding what threats are out there to be realistic about our response. So I think there's a lot of things that we can continue to learn from 9/11 indirectly by the fact that there's still more lessons to be learned.
Ambassador Omar Samad, the United States launched an attack on Afghanistan on October of 2001 to destroy Al-Qaeda. But almost 20 years later, this war on terror is still going on in Afghanistan. There are still American troops in that country. How devastating has this war been for Afghanistan?
Well, listen, initially there was a lot of hope. I was one of those people who, before 9/11, was warning people in Washington and across the world that what is happening in Afghanistan under the Taliban, with Al-Qaeda affiliated with them and other terrorist groups, is a danger not only to Afghanistan but to the world. But not many people were listening until 9/11 unfortunately took place. And then there were no other options left but to attack. So the attack took place. Afghanistan was embarked on a new road, a path that has led to today, when we are now talking as of tomorrow with the Taliban again. The Taliban were dispersed, not defeated. Afghanistan tried to recover from many years of war. It's been a checkered record, in my opinion. I went back to help. Many others did. I am somewhat dismayed at this point by how it was handled. I am a critic also of the management, of the strategies that were used, of not really understanding Afghanistan and its people, of waging a war beyond its limits, and hurting now the cause itself. Now, having said this, there's still a threat of terrorism in that region. There's still a threat that needs to be controlled and contained and at some level monitored. And this is, I think, it offers food for thought on how to do it better. If and when Afghanistan moves from a war footing, which it has been in for a long time, to a peace footing, we need to make sure that that transition takes place responsibly. It does not require any more American or NATO troops to be there, maybe some type of assistance in counterterrorism, but that the Afghan people can take charge of their own country and that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past 20 years.
Very briefly, Ambassador, did you imagine 19 years ago that U.S. troops would still be in Afghanistan today?
Not at all. I remember I was the first spokesperson of the new government in 2001. And every time I was asked about what do I see ahead, I said, well, we are going to rebuild the country. The world is going to help us. The Afghans are going to take charge. The world will be with us until it's needed. But I never thought that it was going to take 19 years. I thought that the most it might take 5 to 10 years. And we kept saying that. But then we saw that every time that we tried to either find a peaceful solution or end the war in some way or another, or defeat the enemy, that it didn't work because the strategies and the policies and the input to policy was not the right one.
Edmund Ghareeb, one of the other consequences of the 9/11 attacks was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, supposedly because of suspicions that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That intelligence, it turned out, was false. Yet we had the war, hundreds of thousands of people killed in Iraq. That includes the United States and other allied soldiers. Millions of people were displaced in Iraq as well. Looking back, how fateful was that decision to go to war?
There is no doubt that this was a very fateful decision. This was a seismic shift in many ways in U.S. Foreign as well as domestic policy. We heard earlier from both of your guests, for example, the increased security that the United States internally began to experience, the fact that there was increasing views of hostility towards Muslims, for example, in general, and Middle Easterners to a certain extent. There was also the rise of the neoconservatives and the neoliberals, the hawks, in the United States, who used this attack, which was in many ways really a shock for many Americans, because the Americans had never experienced anything like this since maybe the days of the Civil War, or even you have to go back to the Pearl Harbor period, because you have a weak neighbor and friendly neighbor to the north, a weak neighbor and friendly neighbor generally to the south, and two oceans. So basically the U.S. was never threatened in any way, but this was used to divert the direction from fighting the war against terrorism to fighting countries like Iraq. That decision was in many ways momentous because it brought about the destruction of one of the most advanced countries in the Middle East. That country had been under severe sanctions. Nevertheless, the country had a middle class, a large middle class, very well-educated people. The war of 2003 destroyed that country, and as General Odom, who's the former head of the National Security Agency, described the war on Iraq as one of the worst disasters in American history, primarily because it led to the increased radicalization that we saw since that time in the region, the increasing anti-Americanism as well. We also saw the displacement of, as you mentioned, millions of people from Iraq, especially the middle class. There are easily 6 to 7 million Iraqis. Many of them are some of the best educated Iraqis are outside the country. It led also to increased internal controls, for example, on immigration in the U.S., more surveillance of people within the United States, more questions about privacy, which undermined privacy. So there were a lot of issues that were brought about as a result of this conflict, including what we saw later on, the rise of extremism and also more interventions as we saw in Syria and Libya, as well as in other places in the region.
That's right. It gave us ISIS, it gave us the surveillance state, it gave us Guantanamo Bay. Lots of things happened in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. Let me bring in Brian Becker. Brian, the United States President, Donald Trump, has been talking about the wars. He says he wants to end these wars in Afghanistan and the Middle East. Let's listen to what he said earlier this week.
A lot of progress is being made in Afghanistan, but we'll be down to 4,000 soldiers in a very short period of time. Likewise, Iraq will be down to about 2,000 soldiers in a very short period of time. And in Syria, for the most part, we're out, other than we kept the oil. As we have soldiers guarding the oil, not too many, I think, small number, but they're guarding the oil.
So, Brian, what do you make of the president's claims that he wants to end these wars?
Well, he certainly has the authority to end them. He is the commander-in-chief. So go ahead and do it, Donald Trump. I mean, he said to the American people when he was campaigning in 2016 that the endless wars in Iraq and Afghanistan should end. I think that contributed to his victory. I mean, if you think about who bared the burden of the war, I mean, in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania, working class places where it was their young people who were sent to kill and be killed in Afghanistan. And people were sick and tired of the wars. They didn't see any point to it. I think a lot of Americans recognize that the real reason the U.S. continued to occupy Afghanistan is that no political leader wanted to take responsibility for the withdrawal because it would be perceived as a defeat, for the same reason that Nixon and Kissinger kept the Vietnam War going for 4 more years. So there was a lot of anger about these wars, and I think Donald Trump gained popularity as a consequence of his position. Now he's running for office again, but I have to ask, why not take the action? I mean, he's been president, he's been commander-in-chief for 4 years. The Democrats, of course, have played a terrible role because every time Donald Trump says anything that sounds like he wants to disengage from war in the Middle East or a peace treaty with North Korea, he gets slammed by the political opposition in Washington for being weak on terrorism. So I would say on both sides of the aisle, there's real culpability, real responsibility here. Of course, Obama ended the troop occupation of Iraq at the end of 2011. But as a consequence of the U.S. invasion, we did have ISIS. That's why ISIS existed. That's why it grew in Iraq. That's why it grew ultimately in Syria. And consequently, the U.S. came back to Iraq. So here we have 5 administrations. It's been 5 straight administrations that have been bombing Iraq. The Iraqi parliament, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, voted unanimously for the American troops to leave. And Donald Trump and the Pentagon said, we're not going to listen to you, as if the United States does not have to listen to the government of Iraq, showing the true colonial character of the occupation of Iraq.
Tony, to Brian's point about young men and women from working class families in the United States being sent to the front lines, you've served in the military. Politicians don't seem to understand that. They don't seem to see what young people are going through.
No, and I've seen videos of young kids in Afghanistan right after one of their colleagues and friends were killed saying, don't they understand we're the good guys? It's like, no, they don't, and we're not. When it comes to certain perceptions, we're occupiers by the perception of the Afghan people in some places. So I'm one of those who agrees that it's time for us to leave the region as best we can to work with our allies. And this is where I think the Pentagon's got it right. I don't believe we ought to just walk away. I don't think that's wise. I think throwing away our investment in the region would be a mistake. With that said, General Joseph Dunford, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs right before Mark Milley, got it right with the by, with, and through strategy, one that my think tank, the London Center, and others helped formulate to assist them with this thinking. The idea is enable our allies, enable the Afghans, enable the Iraqis to invest in their own security. Yeah. We should not be doing that job for them. And so this is where I do agree. It's time for us to pull out of Afghanistan, leave functioning government in place,
Yeah.
and then stop wasting blood and treasure, American blood and treasure, in places where it does not make sense for us to do that.
Right, Tony, there was a report that came out from Brown University. They've been doing a study on, it's called the Costs of War Project. It's an ongoing study. The latest report says that 37 million people have been displaced as a direct result of wars fought by the United States in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. In fact, they even say that that figure might be very low. It could be more like 60 million people who've been displaced all around the world. I mean, is there any way to justify this massive loss of life and the displacement of people and the suffering that it's caused?
I'm not in a position to justify it. I'm in a position to comment on the fact that decisions were made badly to justify military action. And I can say that within the current circumstance regarding the current policies, President Trump doesn't want to continue that trend. That is very clear. And let me be very clear on this point. The idea here is to enable those allies who we work with to be successful in their own defense. Look, I was part of the, in my book, again, I reference it, I was part of the Iraq planning for the invasion, and I was looking at the intelligence saying, what the heck's going on? We had manipulation by people like Doug Feith and the Office of Special Counsel of the Pentagon, essentially lying about what would happen in Iraq, lying about justification to get us in. Colin Powell in front of the UN. Yep. I'm not here to justify any of that. Yep. I wasn't part of that. I think it was bad policy. But what we can do now as an international community and as a U.S. foreign policy community is try to figure out how to move forward. Today, by the way, The Atlantic declared the Nobel Peace Prize should be abolished because President Trump has been successful in negotiating relationships between UAE and Bahrain and the Israelis. Trying to get us out of the business of military and into the business of helping facilitate diplomatic relationships. Now think about that. The neocons, which were referenced earlier, and the neoliberals, which were referenced earlier, have all kind of gone off to the left. Now they're all pro-war Democrats. This is insane. We need to come together to figure out the best policy to prevent massive loss of life and massive exodus of individuals based on military activities which were not justified to begin with.
Yeah. Ambassador, the U.S.-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, well, they extended beyond those two countries. They extended into Pakistan. There were counterterrorism attacks as well. We saw attacks in Somalia, in other African countries as well. And that led in part to a massive immigration and refugee crisis. I mean, could that have been avoided in any way?
I think a lot of things could have been avoided if there was proper strategy, as I said earlier, proper input, proper advice, proper consulting, and that it wasn't driven by just the war frenzy and the profiteering that came with it. Because now we see that with Afghanistan, for example, you are almost at the door of talks. It has been excruciating to reach this point. Just in the last 2 years. But there is an agreement between the Taliban and the U.S. to make sure that by May of 2021, all American troops are out of Afghanistan. But there's also a counter movement here in Washington and other places to say, oh, no, we cannot leave. This is not right. This is not right. This is going on. This is a threat. This is a threat. Whereas all these threats have existed for the past 20 years. And we thought that we had taken care of most of these threats. But there seems to be an appetite for more war by some, and for some quarters to make sure that they still remain in power just because they benefit from it at the cost of lives. And it creates refugees, it creates economic downturns, it creates investment being lost, it creates agony. In the case of Afghanistan, it creates and it breeds new cells of terrorism. And Afghanistan being in a very geopolitically sensitive area, it makes the geopolitics of that region much more complex. And at the end of the day, it might turn out to be a failure for the United States if the United States does not follow the right path. It's going to face defeat in Afghanistan. So this is why you end the war, but by making sure that it's a responsible exit and making sure that the Afghans own the peace and they can come together and go forward.
Edmund Ghareeb, ending wars seems to be a problem in some quarters here in the United States. The United States right now has a small number of troops in Syria, in the Middle East, but there's been some reporting recently that should Joe Biden win the election in November and become president, he wants to expand the United States presence in Syria. I mean, does that set off alarm bells for you?
There's no doubt about that. What we are seeing in Syria, in fact, is that the situation as a result of the external interventions, whether it's the U.S., whether it's Iran, whether it is Turkey, for example, more recently, has contributed and to the worsening of the situation in Syria. And I think if this continues, we're likely to see a much worse conflict in the region. It could lead to the conflict between some of the regional players, by the way, which was one of the byproducts, one of the results of the Iraq War. The Iraq War helped bring to the fore and strengthen some of the regional players, such as Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And internationally, for that matter, we saw the rise of China, the rise of Russia as well, the return of Russia to play. Maybe this is not, many people here may see it as a negative thing, but others may see it as a balancing, these countries playing a balancing role and making it on the international scene. But the problem is that the continued interventions have been very costly, I think, for the U.S. They have helped undermine the U.S. Prestige, U.S. influence, U.S. credibility all over the world. Even financially, the wars, according to Joseph Stiglitz, who's one of the leading American economists, he did 2 studies with a professor from a colleague of his at Harvard, and that they said the costs of the 3 wars, the war on terror, the war on Iraq, and the war in Afghanistan, are really close to $9 trillion now, and the costs are still ongoing. So that means that the U.S. paid a very heavy price. I'm not talking here even about the lives, and that's something else, or people who are wounded, which is, I mean, you cannot put a price on it. But the economic costs of the war have had terrible consequences for the U.S. economy, for the American people who would like to see their infrastructure rebuilt, who would like to see changes in their living standards, improvement. And so as a result, I think it's time for, if President Trump really wants to fulfill the promises he made, this is one of the most important promises that he can fulfill. And I think this would be very important, very helpful to people in the region, people in the United States, and people all over the world.
Brian Becker, President Trump made some comments earlier this week which were very critical of the Pentagon and arms manufacturers. Let's listen to some of what he said.
I'm not saying the military is in love with me. The soldiers are. The top people in the Pentagon probably aren't, because they want to do nothing but fight wars so that all of those wonderful companies that make the bombs and make the planes and make everything else stay happy. But we're getting out of the endless wars. You know how we're doing.
I think, Brian, the only president who said something like that before was President Eisenhower when he was talking about the military-industrial complex. But does this tell us that these key decisions on waging war, etc., are not really made in the interest of national security? They're made by people who want to make a profit.
Indeed. I mean, I think that Donald Trump is engaging in electoral demagogy, because when he came into office, he surrounded himself with what he called my generals. Remember General McMaster, General Mattis, General Kelly. He surrounded himself with generals, but he's had a falling out with them. Mattis resigned when Trump suggested that the U.S. should actually leave Syria. Of course, Trump should be also held account for launching cruise missile attacks against Syria in the first year of his administration without proof that Syria had done anything. That was just basically an assertion. But you're right. I mean, the ABCs of the American military-industrial complex is about making money. I mean, there's a reason that the F-35 is manufactured in 46 different states. The Pentagon says, well, if we farm this out with subcontractors, no congressperson will ever speak against it, even though the weapon might be, you know, overrun, the cost overruns might be in the trillions, literally, by the time the F-35 completes its mission, so-called. Yeah, it's money-making, it's profit. Business, it goes up when there are wars. When the United States, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, by the way, The U.S. was in the middle of a recession, but the Wall Street Journal said this is great for business. And certainly military stocks rose right away in 1979 and 1980. And Ronald Reagan came into office and doubled the military budget over the next 8 years. Yes, the ABCs of the U.S. Pentagon is not about, Pentagon spending is not about defense. That's not what's going on. It's pouring money down a rat hole so contractors and weapons manufacturers can make lots of money, and they do.
Tony, what are your thoughts when you hear things like that? You know, you have experienced war, you know blood and treasure is lost, and when you hear that this is being done to enrich certain people.
I agree. Look, my late friend Jerry Doyle, radio talk guy, talked about combat to commerce as a major factor in policy relating to conflict. I agree that we need to stop it. And I'm sorry, I disagree with certain things that are said. I don't believe Donald Trump supports it. I believe, like any massive bureaucracy, it takes time to slow it down. And yes, President Trump fired people when he figured out, and look, I'll be blunt, what got McMaster fired is walking into the president's office twice saying we need to deploy 100,000 troops to Syria. It got him fired. So I think President Trump made some errors regarding some of the people who he put in place initially. When he figured it out, he got rid of them. And yes, he has been good, true to his word, to not starting new wars. Yep. And those which are ongoing are being curtailed. And look, I believe the F-35, which is going to cost more than our atomic weapons development in World War II, is a massive pig in the poke. I think it's a bad weapon system. Yeah. We need to have an effective defense, not an expensive defense. And again, everybody I work with in the think tank I run focuses on how to achieve that goal.
Right. Ambassador Samad, very quickly, I've just got about a minute left. Peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government are set to resume this week. CNN is reporting that those peace efforts could be jeopardized if President Trump announces a peace in Afghanistan and withdraws American troops too early. Where do you see that going?
Well, as I told you earlier, the American troops are set to leave by May 2021 anyway. Whether President Trump does it earlier or does it afterwards if he wins, or President Biden comes into office. Right. So in any case, I think that what we need to look at is obviously making sure that we have a responsible and sustainable transition in Afghanistan. And that doesn't mean an immediate pullout. It doesn't mean leaving everything and just walking away. Right. It means making sure that the process moves forward and that the Afghans at the end own it.
And thank you, everyone, for that great discussion. We need to leave it there. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for joining us for another edition of The Heat. See you soon.